Hilchos Matnos Aniyim Perek Sheni, the laws of gifts to the poor, chapter 2. Forgive me in advance, this video is being recorded on Erev Pesach, the day before Pesach, which is a very busy and packed day. So the speed is going to be a little bit heightened, more than usual. This class is for the Rambam of tomorrow, the first day of Pesach. However, it happens to be by divine providence that Erev Pesach is the Rambam's birthday. So this video is being recorded on the Rambam's birthday. I didn't actually mention it this morning when we studied the chapter for Erev Pesach. It slipped my mind to mention that we're studying the Rambam on the Rambam's birthday. So I figured at least I'll mention it now, even though the video is not for the class that belongs to the Rambam's birthday, but it's being recorded on that day. And so it should serve to bring all the merits of the Rambam. It says in the Talmud that when a person's birthday, mazalo gover, his mazel, his luck, his spiritual energy is shining that much more. And so the fact that we committed to study the Rambam every single day, one chapter, the Rambam's mazel should shine for us and bring us blessing and success in everything that we do. So to the chapter itself. We're talking about the gifts to the poor. Yesterday the Rambam introduced us to the fact that whenever a harvester or a farmer cuts his field, trees, vineyard, there are different gifts that have to be left for the poor people. The one we're going to be focused on today and tomorrow is Peah. Peah means a corner. And basically the obligation is that when you harvest your field, you don't harvest the whole thing for yourself. You leave a little bit to the poor. At the end of yesterday's chapter we saw, biblically there's no minimal amount. You can leave whatever you want. Rabbinically 1/60th of the field, and proportionally according to how big your field is, according to how many people there are that are needy, and according to how much God blessed you with your crop, you should give perhaps a little more if you can. Today, the Rambam is going to go into the parameters for the types of produce that are obligated to be left peah. In other words, not every single type of produce, when you harvest it, you must leave some for the poor. The Torah uses a specific word which indicates, as the Rambam is going to tell us, actually 5 conditions. The food has to meet 5 conditions in order to be obligated, in order to obligate the farmer to leave peah from that field. That's what we're going to be really focused on, with different variations and cases relating to that. It says the Rambam Malacha Aleph, Kol Oichel, any food, that's condition number 1, it has to be edible. Shagidulav min ha'aretz, which grows from the ground. V'nishmar, and it's guarded. In other words, it's not hefker, it's not ownerless. Ulekitase kule ka'achas, and when it's picked all at once. The Rambam will later give an example. There are some trees that are not picked all at once. They don't have to have peah left from them. Umachnisin oisei lekiyum, and you bring it in for storage. In other words, it's not so perishable. I wrote non-perishable, but it's not totally. But in other words, it's less perishable than most produce. Chayav bepeah. Those types of produce that meet all 5 criteria, it's edible, it grows from the ground, it's guarded, it's picked all together, and it's non-perishable, that, if you cut such a field or such a tree or such a vineyard, you have to leave peah. Shenemar, as it says, the verse here says, when you harvest the harvest of your land. Since the Torah calls it the harvest of your land, from these words we learn all the conditions. It has to be edible, has to be from your land, growing from the ground, etc., etc. Halacha base. The Torah uses the word katzir, which means harvested grain, but the truth is anything that's similar to grain in these 5 respects, that's what's obligated to have peah left from such a field. Kegoyin, the Rambam gives us 9 examples. Hatvua, grain, going from the top left over here. The hakitnias and legumes like beans. The charuvin and carob. The ha'egezim and walnuts. The hashkedim and almonds. The harimayim and pomegranates. The ha'navim and grapes. The ha'zesim and olives. The ha'tamarim and dates. Bein yeveshim, bein rakim, whether dry or fresh. The chol kayetze ba'elu, any of these similar types of produce, if they meet all 5 criteria, they're obligated in peah. Aval, however, istis upua v'chayetze bohen. Istis is indigo. Pua is translated here as rubia, this type of a plant. And anything like that, P'turin, these are exempt because they don't meet the first criteria. They aren't edible food. V'chein kmein upatria, same thing with truffles and mushrooms. P'turin, they're also exempt from peah. When you harvest them, you don't have to leave anything for the poor. They don't grow from the ground like other vegetables, fruits of the ground do. And similarly, ha'hefker, things that are ownerless, pater, are also exempt from peah. There's no one to guard it. Because it's ownerless for all. Doesn't meet the 3rd criteria. And also figs. They're exempt from peah. They're not picked all at once. On the same tree there can be that fig which ripens today. And on the same tree there's a fig, it's only going to ripen after a couple of days. And so too vegetables, potter, they're exempt from peah. They aren't brought in for storage, for long time storage. Garlic and onions, chayavin bepeah. When they're harvested, they have to have peah left from them to the poor, because they are usually dried out and brought in for long-term storage. And so too, what's called mother onions, or we call these seed onions. Essentially, the way onions grow is you can actually let the onions stay in the ground for a long time till they split, and then they grow another type of an onion or a bigger onion, which you can get a lot of seeds from for planting future onions, but it depletes the actual onion itself. Onion is no longer edible. That's called imohes shal bitzalim. You leave them in the ground for a longer time to be able to extract from them their seeds. These are obligated to have peah left from them, even though they aren't so edible. They go into the classification, they meet all the criteria, you have to give peah. And similarly in all other similar cases. So to go back to these 5 criteria, you have edible excluded, as the Rambam said, indigo and rubia. Grows from the ground excludes mushrooms. Guarded excludes hefker. Picked together excludes figs. And non-perishable excludes vegetables. Halacha gimel karka kol shehu chayeves bepeah. How big does your field have to be obligated in peah? Says the Rambam, even the tiniest amount of land is obligated to have peah left from it. Even if it belongs to partners. Because it says in the verse, kitzir artzachem, in the Hebrew, the word is your, in the plural, your land, the harvest of your land. Afilu shel rabim, even if it belongs to a multitude, a majority of people, in this case partners, they have to leave peah. Let's say you have a field which was cut by non-Jews for themselves, or robbers. It was a Jewish field, but the non-Jews cut it, or robbers cut it. Or ants ate it up, they chewed it up. Or it was destroyed by a bad wind blast, or an animal. Now that the stock is no longer standing properly, the grain is no longer standing properly, it's already been cut, whatever remains is exempt from having peah given to the poor. Because the obligation of peah initially begins while it's standing grain. It has to belong to the Jew while it's standing grain, and he has to harvest it and then leave some to the poor. In this case, it's already been harvested, either by a robber, by a non-Jew, by an animal. There's no longer an obligation of peah. Halacha, hey, katzar chetzia, just a picture of harvesting a field. Katzar chetzia v'katzar alistim chetzia shenishar. A person cuts half the field. By the time he finishes his harvesting, he doesn't have to yet give the peah. Peah has to be left at the corner, at the end of the cutting, at the edge of the field. But then, he only finished half of his harvest. V'katzar alistim chetzia shenishar. Robbers came, and they cut the remaining half. Harezu p'tura, now the field is exempt from having any peah left from it. Because where's the obligatory part? The obligatory part is in the half that remains in the hands of the robbers. And they cut it away. But if the order was reversed, in which the robbers would have cut it first, only half the field, and then the owners cut the remaining half of the field, he has to give peah 1/60th of that which he harvested. Not of the whole field, half of it was cut by robbers, but whatever you harvested, you imagine as though it's your own field, and you have to give the proper amount. If the owner harvested half of the field and then sold off the other half, the buyer has to give peah not just from his portion, for the entirety of the field. When he bought the half, he bought the lien of peah that was on it already. Had the owner kept it for himself, he would have to finish harvesting the field and leave peah for the entirety of the field. When the buyer buys that half from him, he buys the half with all of its merits and responsibilities, including leaving peah for the entire field. If a person were to harvest half a field and then consecrate the rest of the holy temple, same principle. The person who ends up redeeming it from the holy temple treasury, as we saw in the end of the last book of the Rambam, there's a whole process for redeeming things from hekdesh. Whoever redeems it, he has to give peah for the entirety of the field. If a person harvests half of the field, and he then goes ahead and harvests that, he goes ahead and consecrates that half which he harvested, even though half of the field is now consecrated, when he continues cutting the rest of the field, which is unconsecrated, he must leave peah for the entirety of the field, including the half that was just consecrated. Halacha vav. Kerem, you have a vineyard, where the person was harvesting some of the grapes to sell in the marketplace. But in his mind, he had the intent that whatever is left and he doesn't harvest, he's going to leave it for the wine press to press it and turn it into wine. So the Rambam says, Im haya baitzer lashuk mikan umikan, if he was harvesting from the marketplace, from this side of the vineyard and that side, it wasn't just one uniform place. It was from here and from there. When he finishes harvesting whatever he's harvesting for the market, and now he harvests the rest of the grapes that are meant to be for the wine press, he has to leave peah only from that amount that was left with the intent of the wine press. Because the things that were cut for the marketplace don't have to have peah left from them. But if he was cutting only from one direction of his field, that's all he was giving to the marketplace. When he concludes and cuts the rest of the vineyard for the wine press, he has to leave peah enough for the entirety of the vineyard. When you're cutting from one direction fully, you don't appear as one who's cutting just, what's called arais temporarily. Ma'at mikan, a little here, a little there, shehu potter, in which case you'd be exempt, as in the first case. When you're cutting from one direction, it seems like a permanent cut, and that means that a vineyard that was cut at that time has an obligation of peah. Yes, you're going to go bring it to the marketplace. When you cut the rest of the vineyard for your wine press, you're going to have to leave peah for everything else. Similarly, from this we learn that whoever picks off little stalks of grain a little bit by little, brings it into his house, even if he ended up picking his entire field, he's going to be exempt from all the gifts to the poor, the fallen stalks, the forgotten stalks, and the corner, as we learned all these three gifts yesterday. A person cuts his entire field, harvests his entire field of grain before it has a chance to fully ripen. Not just fully ripen, it didn't even produce a third of its growth. A third of its growth is usually a demarcation line in halacha, where we consider the grain to already be somewhat mature. It didn't even reach the third. It's totally exempt from leaving any peah for the poor. Once it reached a third of its growth, now it's obligated. You have to leave peah from that field. And same thing applies to fruit of a tree. And if they were concluded a third of their growth, a third of their full ripening, they are liable to have peah left from them when you pick the rest of the tree. A person who consecrates his field, his entire field, when it's all standing grain, when it's harvested, it has to have peah left from it to the poor. If the temple treasurer harvested the grain and then someone else redeemed it, it's exempt. In the moment when it was liable to have peah left from it, i.e. in the moment of harvesting, it was holy. Temple treasurer did the harvesting. And things that are holy, belonging to the temple, don't have to have the obligation of peah left from them. Halacha test, an interesting question. A a non-Jew harvests his field, and then he becomes a convert. It's exempt from all the gifts, from leaving the corner, the fallen stalks, the forgotten stalks. Even though the principle of forgotten stalks, we're going to explore later in these laws. And we're going to learn that the obligation only devolves on the person when he actually gathers the stalks into bundles, and seemingly over here, he hasn't yet done so. But since the core of the harvesting was done in a state of being a Gentile, none of the future obligations can ever come into effect. We may not hire non-Jewish workers to harvest our fields. They're not familiar, they're not expert in the laws of fallen stalks and leaving corners. If you did hire them and they ended up harvesting the entire thing, contrary to the Torah's commandment of leaving peah, it's still obligated to have peah left from it. As we saw yesterday, even if you harvest a full field by mistake, you must give from the stalks, or even if you grind it into flour, even if you make it into bread, you have to give some of it away to the poor. You have a regular homeowner who cut his entire field and he didn't leave any peah. He needs to give, as we said yesterday, from the stocks, the peah to the poor people. However, a very important issue comes into play. And here we're going to return to a slide which we had multiple times. This is called the gifts from the produce, trumas and meisters. Whenever a farmer harvests his crop, he must take 2%, give it to the Kohen, 10% give it to the Levi, another 10% give it to himself, or sometimes to a poor person, and bring it to Yerushalayim. Now, the question is, does this stock, which you have to give to the poor person because you forgot to leave peah, does it have the obligation, like any of your other crops, to first have 2% given to the Kohen, 10% to the Levi? So the Rambam tells us, you have to give peah to the poor from the stocks that you've harvested, and they become fully belonging to the poor. No previous separation of tithes is required. And if you were to decide to be generous and give them most of the harvest as peah, Yesterday at the end of the chapter, the Rambam said you can give as much as you want of Peah. You want to give them the majority, all that grain will be exempt from having any tithes separated from it. Let's say you went to the next stage. You didn't just harvest the field. You even threshed the grain. You didn't winnow it yet, but you threshed the grain and you realize you haven't given Peah. You may give them the Peah and not take any tithes from it. But if you already threshed and you winnowed with a pitchfork or with a mizrah as the special winnowing tool, and you concluded all the work, at this point we say, 1 second, poor people hold off to the side. First, me'aser. First, let the person separate the tithes that he has to separate, 2% to the Kohen, 10% to the Levi, then noisin lahem, and then you're going to have less fruit left over that's going to belong to you. The noisin lahem min aperes hama'usarin. Once you have the produce, which all the tithes were already separated, take from them and give shir ha'peah hara'uya la'isasada, give the full amount of peah which should have belonged to that field. So proportionally speaking, you're going to end up losing more in this case. And that's the punishment for missing the peah in the right time. The same thing applies to trees. Halacha Yud Beis. Says the Rambam a general rule when it comes to peah. Peah, the word peah means corner. And that should tell us about where we leave the peah. Ein manichin as peah ela b'soif hasada. The halacha is, you can't just leave peah wherever you want. You say, in the middle of the field, I'm leaving a little bit for the poor people. It has to be at the edge of the field. And the Rambam gives 4 reasons for this, why this is the halacha. Number 1, Aniyim first of all, to make it practically easier for the poor people. They should know where we're going to come to collect our peah, always the edge of the field. Number 2, we want it to be clearly recognizable to passers-by so as not to arouse suspicion on the farmer that he isn't keeping mitzvahs. If you're allowed to leave wherever you want, he may leave it wherever he wanted, and people passing by would think, hey, maybe this guy didn't give any peah, and they'll come to suspect him, perhaps he doesn't keep mitzvah scrupulously. To protect that, always leave it at the end of the field, no confusions. Number 3, to protect us from cheaters, so that the person not intend to cut his entire crop. And when the people see him cutting the end of the field, he'll just tell them, I left my peah in the beginning of the field. And he'll dray everybody a cup, as we say in English. The beginning guy will say, I left it at the end. The end will say, I left it in the beginning. And then he leaves nothing in the end. That's number 3. And furthermore, number 4, yesterday we said that peah is not your prerogative to give it to whoever you want. It's first come, first serve. But if you were allowed to leave peah wherever you wanted in your field, so the harvester would watch for a good time, when nobody's around, and then leave the peah, and he'll be able to give it to a poor person who's close to him, relative. He'll say, hey, come to me at 4 o'clock, we'll cut the field, boom, we'll give you that part. Not allowed. And for all these reasons, peah is only left at the corner, at the edge of the field. So much so that if a person transgressed and left peah anywhere but the end of the field, in the beginning of the field, the middle of the field, harezu peah, we declare it as peah. It's got to go to the poor people. And at the end of the field, you have to leave again. You have to leave enough peah to cover the remainder of the field, whatever remains after you left the first part. So you got to give double peah essentially. If a homeowner gave his peah to the poor, and they asked him, please give us on this side of the field, and he gives them from the other side of the field, zu peah, both are peah, because this they asked for and this he gave. If a homeowner or owner of a field separates peah and he says, this is peah and also this, or this is peah and this, they're both considered peah, they both go to the poor people. Workers, if you're a hired worker, you cannot harvest the entire field. They must leave at the edge of the field the proper amount of peah. However, the poor people cannot grab it until the homeowner himself mindfully separates the peah and declares it peah for the poor. Therefore, when a poor person sees peah being left at the edge of the field, it would be forbidden for him to touch it. It would be considered thievery, robbery, unless he knows for sure that it's being done with the intent of the homeowner. The Rebbe once commented, how did this work practically? This would basically mean that the homeowner would have to stand there, unless he put up a sign. But personally, he would have to stand there and let everybody know, take this, it's peah, you can take it. And what would emerge from this is that the poor people would end up eating from the field of this homeowner before the homeowner had a chance to eat himself. Because he had to be there first to supervise the peah giving out to all the poor people. Then he can go home and eat his grain, which basically tells us a lesson about tzedakah. Sometimes when you want to spread to others goodness, whether it's physically or spiritually, it may come with sacrifice to yourself. You end up giving to others before you treat yourself out. Tesvav hapeah shel tvua v'kitnios v'chayetze b'hem Yisraelim hanikzarim. Any peah that's left to the poor, from grains or legumes or from any other similarly edible plants that are harvested, v'chein pa'as hakerem v'hailanis, and peah left from a vineyard or from trees, mitenes b'mechuber lekarka, must be left when the fruit or the produce is attached to the ground. As you see over here, not harvested, actually attached. V'ha'aniyim b'izes v'neisa b'yadam, and you leave it attached. The poor people would have to grab it by hand. We don't let the poor people come with harvesters and sickles and saws. You can't cut it with any axes. It's going to prevent some abuse. We don't want people to hit each other with their tools. No tools. It's hands-on only. If all the poor people agree, let's cut it and divide it equally, they can divide it. But if there's even one guy saying to follow the regular halacha, if there's 99 people saying divide, and one guy says let's grab it, we must listen to the one guy because he said the proper halacha. So if you have grain, the halacha is you got to grab it. If everybody agrees to divide, fine. But if not everybody wants to divide, you don't divide. On the other hand, halacha tazayin, peah shel dalis v'shel dekel, if it's peah being left from a palm tree or a grapevine, she'ein aniyim magin lo b'zaysa ela b'sakana gedela, if you're going to force the poor people to go ahead and grab it on their own, they're only going to be able to reach it by putting themselves in grave danger. Ba'al habayis moeded iso mechalik isa beinu aniyim, the homeowner must go up, bring it down, and divide it among the poor people. And in this case, it's the opposite. And if everybody agrees to go and grab it, first come, first serve, then they can grab it. But if there's 99 saying grab and only one person says divide, we listen to this one guy because he declared the proper halacha. We force the homeowner to bring it down and divide it amongst everybody. Halacha yudzayin b'shalish ites bayom, 3 times a day. We give out peah to poor people in the field, or we let them grab, whatever the case may be. If it's grain grabbing, if it's a palm tree giving it out, or if they all agreed on one method. Point is, peah is given out 3 times a day. Morning, midday, and in the afternoon mincha time. If a poor person comes at a different time, we don't let him take. Why? We want to have one unified time where all poor people come and take their stuff. Why do they make once a day? If you're looking for a uniform time, so make it only once. Says that Rambam, there's different people who want to service. There are poor women that are nursing, have to eat in the beginning of the day. They come in the morning. There are young poor people who aren't awake in the morning. They're not going to reach the field till halfway through the day. There are even elderly people. They're only going to reach the field by afternoon time, and therefore you give the peah 3 times a day. A poor person is in a field trying to grab as much as he can. He takes part of the peah with his hands and he throws what he just picked onto the other standing grain. Or he falls onto it. You have a little comedic picture over here, guy falling on the grain. Or he spreads out his cloth, his talis, over the grain, trying to demonstrate his ownership over the other grain, basically. We actually find him. You're poor, Torah gives you a gift, take what you get. Don't try to grab too much. We find him and we actually remove him from whatever he threw or landed on or put his talis on. Even what he already took, we take away from him. And we give it to another poor person. The same rule applies to fallen stocks, forgotten stocks. You take what you get, and you don't get upset, and you don't start grabbing more than what you can actually take with your hands. A person grabs peah that was left for the poor, and he says, this is, I'm getting this on behalf of Mr. So-and-so, the poor person. If the person who grabbed the grain is himself a poor person, we have an halacha, it's called a migoy. Migoy de zachi lenafshei, zachi nami lechavrei. That's the Talmudic lexicon. Since he's able to get it himself, he's a poor person, he can also take it for somebody else. But if the person grabbing the peah is a rich person, he he doesn't acquire it on behalf of his poor friend. It's first come, first serve. You got to give it to the poor person who you find first. If you have a homeowner facing a crowd of poor people and he says, hey, this peah is going to be for you. And all of a sudden from behind, comes a poor person, sneaks up from behind and grabs it. Now, the homeowner promised it to the crowd in front of him, but this guy's actually holding it in his hand. Who do we follow? Says the Rambam, the poor person who grabbed it, he gets it. Because the rule is a person only acquires the gifts to the poor, the fallen stocks, the forgotten stocks, the peah. And in fact, v'sela shel metzia, even a coin of a lost object. You only acquire it ad sheyagia liyodeh, once it reaches your hand. Possession is what matters. You're holding it, you get it. Yeah, you weren't ethical, yeah, you're a mean guy, but the bottom line is you're holding it, you get to keep it.